Edith Hall is one of Britain's foremost classicists. She earned her PhD from Oxford and has held posts at Cambridge, Oxford, Durham, and London universities. She now teaches at King's College in London. She's published 20 books. She appears regularly on BBC Radio, and she's acted as consultant to professional productions of ancient drama at the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Theatre, among others. Dr. Hall lectures all over the world and is published widely in many academic and mainstream journals and newspapers. Her original specialty was ancient Greek literature, but she writes and speaks about all aspects of ancient Greek and Roman history, society, and thought. We're psyched to have her on the show. Hi, Dr. Hall. Welcome to the program.
Hello, Jordan. Pleased to be with you.
Thanks. So I just want to start by asking you, I like to ask all of my guests this question. How did you become a classics major? What gravitated you towards studying the ancient world?
Well, I think there are three answers to that, and they're all in there. One is that my dad was a Protestant, he's still alive, Protestant priest. So there were actually strange things like the New Testament in Greek lying around our house. So I asked him about the strange writing. It fascinated me. Then I was a absolutely avid TV watcher. When people say television is bad for children, well, I watched so much TV, but maybe it was better quality in those days. And I just used to watch movies like Jason and the Argonauts, the great early 1960s.
Ray Harryhausen, yeah.
Yeah, with the great Harryhausen special effect. And I just thought it was the coolest thing I had ever seen in my life.
It is the coolest thing.
Amazing. And then I really went, once I was given the opportunity to read some Greek literature in English, actually, not Greek, things like the Odyssey and the tragedies, I just found it the most wonderful sort of escape zone of my life. And I nearly read English at university, and I even got a place to do English and classics combination. And once I'd gone to university, I thought, well, I can read English for the rest of my life, and I do. I read English literature. But was I ever going to sit down, and be at Oxford and be able to read all of Homer and all of Aristotle in Greek? No. So I'd actually changed to full classics in the end.
So did you have Latin and Greek training when you were growing up, or did you learn these languages?
Yeah, I was incredibly lucky. I'm one of the last generation of British state school kids, so not fee-paying and public system, who got offered them. I mean, that's all gone now. It's practically all gone. And there's a terrible apartheid in Britain educationally, that 93% of our teenagers go to state school, only 7% go to fee-paying school, and that 7% most of them still get Latin and Greek, and it seems to me a great injustice.
Yeah, it's the same situation here in the States. I am lucky enough to work at a charter school that teaches Latin and Greek, and they make the kids take it. So I want to hold up your 2015 book. This is called Introducing the Ancient Greeks, From Bronze Age Seafarers to Navigators of the Western Mind. This book was fantastic. It's really beautifully written and highly accessible. And it makes some big, broad claims, and I actually like when authors do that. It's fun for someone who's new to this, so I like that. It has 10 chapters, and each of the 10 chapters visits a different Greek community at different moments over the course of the 20 centuries. You go through all of that. You start with the rise of the Mycenaean world, starting at around 1600 BC, and you end with the victory of Christianity over the pagan world there during the 4th century AD. For this show, I was particularly interested in your chapter on Athens. I think that's chapter 5, as it pertains to Greek drama and philosophy. But I wanted to start with the preface and the introduction of your book, and I'd like to read a short segment of your book and then get a response from you. In this passage, you're talking about the advances, the innovations, the contributions delivered by the Greeks, and I want to read this. Please bear with me. It's a little bit of a long one, but I really want to get your response on this. It has become a new orthodoxy that the Greeks were very similar to their ancient Near Eastern neighbors in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Persia, and Asia Minor. Some scholars have gone so far as to ask whether the Greeks came up with anything new at all, or whether they merely acted as a conduit through which the combined wisdom of all the civilizations of Eastern Mediterranean was disseminated across the territories conquered by Alexander the Great before arriving at Rome and posterity. Others have seen sinister racist motives at work and accused classicists of creating in their own image the oldest dead white European males. Some have even claimed that classicists have systematically distorted and concealed the evidence showing how much the ancient Greeks owed to Semitic and African peoples rather than to Indo-European traditions. And I'm just going to do this one last paragraph here. The question has thus become painfully politicized. Critics of colonialism and racism tend to play down the specialness of the ancient Greeks. Those who still maintain that there was something identifiably different and even superior about the Greeks, on the other hand, are usually conservatives who have a vested interest in proving the superiority of Western ideals and in making evaluative judgments of culture. My problem, and that's you, is that I fit into neither camp. I'm certainly opposed to colonialism and racism and have investigated reactionary abuses of the classical tradition. But my constant engagement with the ancient Greeks and their culture has made me more, rather than less, convinced that they evinced a cluster of brilliant qualities that are difficult to identify in combination, and in such concentration elsewhere in Mediterranean or in ancient Near Eastern antiquity. So a cluster of brilliant qualities that is difficult to find elsewhere in Mediterranean or ancient Near Eastern history. So Dr. Hall, what are these qualities? What makes the Greeks special as a people? In your introduction, you list 10 distinct qualities. Can you talk about these qualities, if you can remember all 10 or at least some of them, and maybe bring this into a broader discussion about what these general qualities led to over time, and maybe even for us? How did these qualities enable certain artistic, philosophical, cultural achievements?
Okay, it's a matter of these qualities. I think there is a character, a cultural personality of the ancient Greek, partly defined by the very language that they spoke, and so how their brains were formed by that language. And I do think we can describe it. But before I do that, I also think we can try and explain how some of their qualities, which are actually now getting them into a lot of trouble, and meaning that finding it doesn't work quite so well in global capitalism, some of those qualities were precisely what enabled them to, for example, invent rational science, empirical medicine, and philosophy, and those other great achievements. So it's a matter of those qualities in a particular time and place, not that those qualities are sort of transcendentally superior. The other thing I would really like to emphasize, because the paragraphs you've read out, parts of them have been quoted selectively, very controversially, by people who are trying to make out that I'm precisely an old-fashioned colonial racist.
Oh, that's a shame.
I know, it's okay, but people do this in this highly sensitive arena. You are walking on eggshells, and I knew if I came out and said, actually, to underestimate what the invention of rational science, empirical medicine, philosophy, and the laws of logic, by Aristotle, the actual setting out, the enthymeme, and all the rest of it, to underestimate that achievement is itself extremely dangerous, and shows that we're living in terror of kangaroo courts and political correctness and not being allowed free discussion. So I knew I was going to get criticised, but my big answer to that, and the bit that those people who make that argument always leave out, is that I say that one of their great gifts was this openness we'll talk about with Athens, which is that they were by far the most multicultural of the ancient Mediterranean societies. They were in contact with far more groups. They intermarried everywhere they went. They had extraordinary cultural absorption and hybridity. So they're like somewhere like New York at its very, very best. with as many different languages going on, down the side streets from the major avenues, leading to this wonderful flowering of intercultural cross-fertilization. So they got to give us all the ideas of the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Thracians, the Scythians, the Hittites, the North Africans, the Nubians, precisely because they were the ones in these incredibly fast little boats skidding around founding colonies and intermarrying everywhere. So my argument is actually that to say that they're really great is to say that multiculturalism is great. So I just need to say that.
And you were very careful about that. You were actually actively going out and making the case that it was not some innate genetic superiority predisposition, that this is this interesting flowering, this cultural moment in history, and I don't want to say accidental, but it's...
They lived, the crucial thing is, you just look at a map of how they lived. They lived all around, not just the Mediterranean, but the Black Sea as well, and this is crucial. The northeastern Greeks were some of the most brilliant at philosophy, especially post-classical philosophy. And the colonies up there, which started in the 8th, 9th centuries BC, it was the experience of actually having to build ships that could survive Black Sea conditions and things like that brought on navigation and astronomy and so many other basic skills. And viticulture, you know why viticulture developed? You know why how they discovered plant grafting, how to actually do genetic modification of plants, because they could not make wine in the North Black Sea, and the Greeks had to have their wine. So they spent 200 years figuring out how to create a vine. So it's that necessity being the mother of invention kind of thing. But they never lived, or hated to live, more than 25 miles inland. So the map of ancient Greece is not the map of ancient Greece, it's a map of the ancient Greek-speaking city-states fringing both the Mediterranean and the Black Sea for 25 miles in contact with hundreds of other ethnic groups. They didn't have this idea of a big inland landmass. The only set of Greeks who ever went very, very far inland were those who went with Alexander across the Punjab and Afghanistan to India. And you know what? They lost their language in 200 years. The ones who went inland did. The ones who stayed on the coasts still are speaking Greek.
That's interesting. That's so interesting.
Absolutely, because their real relationship is with the Greeks just over the water, right? So what I tried to do in that book, which got very, very harshly criticised by some orthodox classicists, including in the Wall Street Journal, the reviewer there said, this is extraordinary. She's giving us a history of the ancient Greeks from the point of view of the sea. Where's the polis in all this? Now, I do mention city-state absolutely all the time. Every chapter's about a different city-state. But I did exactly say, let's look at them as seafarers, because I think that is a fundamental part of their identity and their cultural personality. That openness that the Athenians, all of them were like that. But I think the ones who were the most like that, in the most concentrated form, because they were conscious of it and proud of it, and actually advocated it as a conscious policy, and said, we are the great innovators because we welcome everybody. They actually said it.
Right, I remember that from chapter 5.
Best of North American, outward-looking, welcoming. We are the greatest country in the world because we are every country in the world. Right. That was very much the ancient Athenian attitude. And when they needed expertise from either other Greek city-states, so Pericles in the glory days of Athens that I write about in that chapter, who is general, which means basically president, at the time that Sophocles was writing, for example, his great tragedies, he set about inviting the greatest minds from all over the world to come to Athens. He brought Herodotus over from Turkey. What's now Turkey. Herodotus, who invented history, was half not Greek, probably. He was from Caria and Lycia. He invited the great northern Greek philosophers, Democritus, who invented the atom, and Protagoras, who invented democratic political theory. He invited them down from northern Greece. He invited Gorgias from Sicily. He invited great shipwrights from Crete, the great sea captains from the islands. So he knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, and there was a great quote in there. I mean, your chapter is actually called "The Open Society of Athens," and I'll read my listeners another quote here. You say that democratic Athens brought Greek civilization to the, quote, apex of creativity, and you go on to say that of all the Greek communities studied in this book, The classical Athenians, perhaps to a greater degree than any other community you studied, quote, demonstrated their ample endowment with every one of the 10 characteristics that define the ancient Greek mindset. And you go on, quote, yet the feature of the Athenian character that underlies every aspect of their collective achievement is undoubtedly their openness to innovation, to adopting ideas from outside, and to self-expression. Can you elaborate on how their openness and how their welcoming philosophy, can you elaborate on what that led to, what qualities that produced in them for this great civilization?
I mean, it might be helpful if we try and run through the other 9 characteristics.
Right, right.
So the first one I kick off when I talk about the actual Mycenaean world is that they're seafarers. So that in so many ways, they were cultural amphibians, they were brilliant swimmers and divers, but they felt very restless if they couldn't get on their ships and scuttle around, finding out, like Odysseus, about the other creatures inhabiting the universe. They were extremely stroppy. Do you use the word stroppy in America?
We do not.
Okay.
That's a Britishism.
It means rebellious if you feel that you're being oppressed in any way.
So rebellious against authority.
Yeah, rebellious against authority, questioning of authority. So they still are. And they find working in hierarchies extraordinarily difficult. I think there is actually a fundamentally egalitarian streak. They're not at all good at serving other people if they think they're stupid or whatever. So this is why they constantly colonized everywhere, because they fell out with each other, or sons fell out with their fathers, or very often you had a poor family where the oldest brother got the farm. The younger brothers had a choice of either basically slaving away for the older brother or going off and finding their own new. This is very pioneer sort of spirit, and I think a lot of Americans really relate to that. So they're fundamentally highly independent. They are highly individualistic. So this is the first great literature in the world where the author's always telling you his name or her name. So Sappho says, I'm Sappho and I'm singing of Aphrodite. Or Herodotus says, these are the inquiries of Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Or even on the beautiful vases we've got from classical Athens, the one that people imagine when you think of a Greek vase, the red and black ones, they say things like, I was made by Exarchestides. Exarchestides writes his name on it. So they have this strong sense of the I. They're obsessively curious, inquisitive, but in a good way. I mean, it can get them into trouble. It nearly gets Odysseus' all his men killed by the Cyclops,
right,
because he wants to know what's going on in the cave. But it can equally lead you to say, I don't believe that river is clogging up. This is how ancient science began. This is how it began. I do not believe that the river Meander is getting silted up because God is angry. I believe it's getting silted up because the waters are bringing down lots of silt, there's alluvial dust, and depositing it.
Right, exactly.
So the curiosity led them to go beyond religious explanations, go beyond superstition. And we're all indebted to that. We are incredibly indebted to that curiosity. Then you've got the openness of Athens. You've got the humour of Sparta, which people found it very funny that I put humour in this grim militaristic society, but I did.
That is surprising.
Yes, I know, but I actually think they brought a certain kind of wit, the mordant wit that gets you through tough things. I actually decided that I was going to talk about that in Sparta. Why not? Because we've got these whole collections of humorous Spartan sayings.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay. If you've watched the movie 300, you get a few of them from Gerard Butler. That's right. So somebody comes to him when he's only got a few hundred men and he's got the entire Persian army coming and saying, they say, the sky is black because of their archers. You have no idea. The sky is black. It is so full of arrows. So he says, no, let's flee from the battlefield, but let's fight in the shade.
I know, that's such a great line.
Exactly. Or the Persian king traditionally demanded some earth from, when he invaded Greece, he thought everybody would capitulate because he so outnumbered them and his forces had such superior just weaponry, hardware, military hardware. So he sent to Sparta and said, you have to give me some soil to show that you capitulate. This was the initial thing if you wanted to avoid battle. And, Leonidas, king of the Spartans, just says, Mollo and Labick, come and get it. Tell him to come and get it. So it's this very, very, very brief, concise humour.
Right.
Then when you get to the next century, 3rd century BC, you get the enormous Greeks, the Greeks in their sense of only big is great, right? So you've got the Library of Alexandria. We don't just have a few papyrus rolls. We have to create the biggest library that anybody's ever created in the world. And we have to have the biggest this and the biggest that. And not only that, we're going to translate every piece of literature in every language in the world into Greek. That's when the Septuagint, the Hebrew text, started getting translated into Greek. I mean, it's just, this is after Alexander, of course, but we've had the biggest empire. Now we need the biggest library, and they start building bigger and better ships. Then the last 3 chapters are about the brilliance of their language and just their superb prose books, which come very much under the Roman Empire. And I think I've missed out one, I just can't remember what it is, but the very final chapter is about pleasure. And one of I think, the most important things that distinguished pagan Olympian religion from the Christianity that did conquer it was this very strong pleasure principle, that actually bodily pleasure, cultural pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, physical pleasure, eating, drinking and sex are all actually really wonderful. And when you're doing them, you're doing it for the glory of God. I mean, literally, you have magnificent festivals, you get incredibly drunk, you go to the Temple of Aphrodite to get as sexy as you possibly can when you're getting married or whatever. This, of course, was complete anathema to the early Christians. So
right.
You hear who even shut down the theatres. It wasn't just the temples. They couldn't have dancing. They couldn't have their beautiful music. They couldn't have their laughter. And I think that's one way that the ancient Greeks are actually really post-Freud, come back into their own. People don't want to be told they're sinners if they enjoy themselves. Of course, we need morality. And of course, we need moderation in some of our pleasures.
Absolutely.
But the idea that pleasure is inherently evil is something I think very few people, except for those in monotheistic religions, now hold.
I imagine this is kind of where Nietzsche gets a lot of his thinking from. The idea that to suppress what is pleasurable is, in some sense, anti-human or something like that. And the idea.
Professor of Greek at Basel. I mean, he is professor of Greek literature. He has the same job as me. I mean,
yeah, totally. So that was great. So one thing I want to ask from the introduction is, I also liked what you said about the tendency in modern scholarship of downplaying the role of individual excellence in the shaping of history. Because I think for the last 30 or 40 years, it's been trendy to just emphasize the extent to which social, economic, political forces mold the individual, shape history, and obviously they do. But this is, I think, often done to the exclusion of looking at the individual, maybe even the heroic figures that change and shape the course of history. You say, quote, "This type of account assumes that history is uncomplicated enough to be understood without acknowledging the individual brains," I like how you put that, "as well as broad contexts," unquote. So can you elaborate on this point for my listeners just a little bit? Because I was so struck by that and kind of surprised that you had the gall to say that, and I was impressed.
Well, I don't see it as gall. I mean, I'm going to warn you, I'm going to use a word called Marxism here, okay? So I am, broadly speaking, when I try to understand the history of the world, a Marxist.
Oh, you're talking to a libertarian right here.
Okay. I'm a Marxist. I'm a moral. I mean, Marxism not as a political position, but as a way of understanding history.
Okay.
That is simply that economic forces and economic circumstances, the availability of raw materials, and economic exigency, the need to get fed, watered, survive, these are broadly speaking the most important determinants of human history. Okay, I do genuinely believe that, and that competition over those natural resources and who commands them is a motor of history, and that the hatred between different economic classes that produces, especially since the Industrial Revolution, has always been a motor of change and of history, of revolution.
I agree with you.
That makes me a Marxist with a small m. Okay? It does. And I always, whenever I look at any new society, say, where is the money coming from? What is the industry? What is the source of income? Who owns the factories or farmland or whatever? That is how I go about it. And actually, I think most of us do. I think most sensible historians these days are Marxists with a small m. Okay? That does not make us revolutionary communists. That's just different. Okay? But in France, they have a tradition of that, which is called anti-humanist, right? Which means that everything is reduced to economic
right,
forces.
Which is what I can't stand. I don't like that.
I am a good old-fashioned British humanist who, while accepting completely that we've got to do huge amounts of economic history to understand change, that human beings are agents and human beings differ and human beings have different gifts, and that the right gift at the right time can be absolutely transformative in either hastening or impeding these rather grim forces that we can't necessarily do an awful lot about. If we run out of coal, we run out of coal. But we might have a brilliant mind like Aristotle, a scientist, who said, well, what if we use the sun to power things? Right? If you haven't got the brilliant guy who'd been trained at Plato's academy, right, the right mind, the right time, the right nurturing. And I think that's what, because once the Greeks realised the nature of the human intellect, that's the other thing. You don't find the Sumerians or the ancient Egyptians talking about somebody being incredibly able intellectually. You don't find it. You have great warriors and great kings. The Greeks got that nous, intelligence, mind, is something that you can have more or less of, and that it can be radically changed by education. So that you can either completely, Aristotle's very, very good on this, you can completely wreck someone's potential by abusing them as a child or not educating them properly, and you can completely facilitate their potential. And his potential was facilitated. He rolled up at the academy when he was 17, and he founded almost all our ways of doing empirical science as well as moral philosophy. I mean, he's a giant.
Oh, yeah. He did everything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we remember him for his logic and his ethics, but he did everything, right?
Well, he's the father of zoology. People just don't realise this. And he invented, most importantly, though it sort of sounds dry, but the rules of logic which apply to all the disciplines.
Right.
He was the one who formulated them.
Absolutely.
And it's in the Organon, it's in these 6, unbelievably, he worked out every single syllogism you could possibly use, and it sounds so dry as dust, but people who are drawing inferences from observations every day are Aristotelian.
Right.
Full stop. I mean, you know that, you studied philosophy.
Yes. Yeah. So
but here you see, he comes along in the 4th century after, Socrates. He goes to the academy which Plato and Socrates founded. But it's only he's already building on hundreds, decades of Greek science and philosophy, and he's brilliant.
Like who specifically, who is he drawing on the most, would you say? Well,
that's really interesting. I mean, and that is now, my next book is about Aristotle.
I read about that.
Yeah. He takes half of it from Plato. I mean, he's clearly a Platonist in response, but this unbelievable, overwhelming difference that the only world that matters is the world we're in now, the material world that we can see around us and experience as physical bodies, and that we will die. When we die,
right?
Coming to be and passing away. But that as the most superior animal, he's the only, Plato doesn't go around calling humans an animal. We know we're simply the political animal. We're just slightly more advanced animal than any other. We have total responsibility because we can deliberate to the planet. I mean, this has huge ramifications for environmentalism, apart from anything else, that we are responsible for this planet as the best animal, or not the morally best at all. In fact, he says humans can do a lot more harm than animals because of this intellectual ability. So in that, he's a Democritean. In that, he takes the atomism.
Right. Right.
Of the material scientists, he's also a Democrat, I think, ultimately. Although he, and Plato certainly isn't. Ultimately, although he criticises all four types of constitution, democracy, monarchy, oligarchy, and tyranny, he absolutely condemns the three non-democratic ones more. Interesting enough, for today, he says the great fault of democracy is it can easily slip into tyranny if you don't educate the people.
Right, and instead Plato said, well, you still got to educate the people, but democracy's bad. Democracy's not...
We simply can't ever educate them enough to make laws.
Right.
I mean, it is fundamentally elitist.
I don't know if you read Arthur Herman's The Cave in the Light. Did you get a chance to look at that?
I don't know.
It's about Plato and Aristotle, and I think his project, I haven't read the whole thing, but I think his project is to sort of document how Aristotle's philosophy has been sort of embraced by the conservative right, interestingly enough. And Plato more so in the domain of continental philosophy and postmodernism and that sort of thing. So that interesting split.
Aristotle, though, has been claimed by the left too. I mean, Karl Marx thought he was a genius.
Because he was a dialectical materialist.
Well, I'm not sure he was a dialectical materialist, but he was certainly a materialist. And to me, the great split in European philosophy is between materialism and idealism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that split is between Plato and Aristotle.
And that's what his book is about, exactly.
Yeah, right. But I don't think the materialism, that tends to get because of the way that word is understood in a popular way.
I know.
It's quite difficult to explain that it actually simply means that we don't think there's another transcendental word of ideas or an afterlife or active gods or whatever, that what we're interested in all the time is the here and now and improving it. I mean, the way I understand that in Christian terms is I was brought up in a Christian household. I can kind of do that, which is split between the sort of 17th century Protestants who are quite clear that we're building the kingdom of heaven here, not waiting for it in the other life.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
I think humans have got the brains to sort most of our problems if we have the will and create as near to heaven as the fact that we're mortals. I think we have that potential, and I think Aristotle thought we had that potential.
Yeah. So that's a progressive idea.
We're not activating our potential, and none of us takes enough responsibility for other people doing so. And he's very clear that we all live in a society. Anyway, you can hear that I'm a bit obsessed with Aristotle at the moment.
I love his virtue ethics. I read Michael Sandel's book, Justice, and he spends, I don't know, a fourth of the book talking about virtue ethics. And I teach ethics, and I spend a long time on it as well. It's just so different from consequentialism and utilitarianism and Kantian ethics. It's just so radically different. But I want to actually shift on to I want to go back a little bit to the openness. You talk about the cultural openness of ancient Athens. You were referring to this before. You quoted Pericles in a speech where he's praising the Athenian soldiers who had died in battle, and he says, quote, "We throw open our city to the world and never expel a foreigner or prevent him from seeing or learning anything." And you go on to say that Athenians were fearless about allowing others to scrutinize their way of life from within, which I love that, fearless to criticism. Yeah. I was fascinated by this passage, and to be honest, the first thing that came to my mind was this concept that goes back to Homer of xenia, and which, I mean, this is like rough translation, but it means like guest-host relationship. Both sides have an obligation, hospitality, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if this openness stems from something that's deeply embedded within Greek mythology. I'm wondering if this openness stems from the idea of xenia and the fact that this idea of being hospitable looms so large in the Greek psyche. Yeah, well, it still does. I mean, I have to say, there is nobody better at
inviting the whole street to a party in the world than the Greeks. There just isn't. But having said that, no, you're quite right. The trouble with Xenia is precisely trying to find a translation that's adequate to it. When people talk about hospitality or guests and friends, it sounds like the hotel business or something.
Right.
Tourist business. This is about one of the biggest terrors in ancient society. That is, going in, it's the right. Xenia means the right of, accepted by international sense of decency, right, for an unarmed man to go into a foreign country and pass amongst people in safety. If they touch him, the Greeks thought they would be hit with a thunderbolt. They actually, such is the religious protection, such is the taboo. This enabled heralds, ambassadors, and diplomats and businessmen, when it's working, to move freely without fear in a place where they could easily be murdered and robbed, just like that, without anybody, any comeback, they have no legal rights, right? This is about a fundamental taboo that goes beyond law. Equally, if you're a host in Greece, if you invite, if 6 or 7 people from another country turn up and you say, come into my house for dinner, I mean, what is to stop them getting up in the middle of the night, stabbing you or raping your women, right? And just
Zeus.
Only that taboo. And that is the incredibly powerful thing. Now, the point about the Athenians, you're absolutely right, but is that they created a culture where that was the accepted norm completely. So even though the Athenians weren't even that religious, I think it was quite secularized. They were incredibly proud of the fact, and as Aristotle says, they certainly never bore arms, which is another thing current Americans could do well to think about. They thought that was shocking.
Right.
Completely shocking if you had a society where citizens had to bear arms, right? Because the whole idea is that Xenia, the absolute imperative that you can meet strangers all the time while feeling safe, which we still have a little bit of in this country. I don't feel frightened when I go into a classroom or on the underground. I do not, the chances of me getting shot are so tiny relative.
And I think in America, it has a little bit more to do with actually our history with your nation.
Bizarrely.
Leaving and seceding and forming a new nation and having militias that needed to take up arms.
I know.
It's going to be, speaking of that, it's going to be really difficult to make any kind of change in that direction. I
do understand all of that history. I also understand how something that starts out as a positive freedom thing can dialectically change into its opposite. But what Aristotle says is that no lawgiver can ever anticipate all future developments. The laws must be constantly susceptible to revision in the light of evidence. I mean, he's quite absolutely. So this idea that founding fathers of any kind have their words written in stone, it would be anathema. You just don't do that. I just find it interesting. All I'm trying to say is that it's interesting that one of the definitions of Athenian open society was only a really crazy place would have lots of weapons in it.
Gotcha.
Weapons of the battlefield against your enemies.
Yeah, right.
They're just not for when you're talking to each other and walking down the street in a civilized urban environment.
Right. To be fair to the founding fathers, I will say this. I think that one of the things they did get right was this idea that the country and the Constitution is founded on these negative rights. So just rights from being messed with. And then you're right. The laws from within that, we can vote to change anything. Yeah. But those negative rights, that's the platform that doesn't change. To be fair to people who don't understand what originalism means to Americans. Okay. But I also, towards the end of the chapter, you talk about city Dionysia, and I wanted to get into that because you wrote quite a bit about this towards the end of that chapter. This is the Athenian festival where the tragedies were actually performed, and I'm doing a series of 3 episodes about Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. And so I wanted to ask you because I actually found it quite hard to get any specific information about the way that these festivals worked. What were they like? In your book, you write about Dionysiac processions and singing and dancing and hymns and sacrifices. So could you walk my listeners through this festival? How did it work?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I think those of your listeners who've ever been lucky enough to go to India or to Malaysian countries which have polytheistic festivals, or even Japan, right, need to think in terms of the kind of colour and noise and smells and bells of the temples. You get a much I found that the bustle, the sense of bustle and food roasting and perfumes and noise and constant clanging and prayers and undressing and dressing of beautiful painted colourful statues, that is what you have to think in terms of, not like quite white sages going around in stable roles. So the entire city comes to a standstill. So this is April, the Great Dionysia. It's a very exciting time of year in Greece. The weather starts to get really lovely, but it's not overly hot. The blossom is out. The birds are singing. The grasshoppers are growing off on the trees again. And the ships are coming into the harbour. That is the crucial thing that they didn't sail much in the deep winter. Actually, it was Philip of Macedon who started that. Before that, they didn't. So everything, spring is springing like nothing on earth. And the city is absolutely packed because everybody from all over the Greek world came to this. So it's a combination of Super Bowl, Christmas, Easter, Super Bowl, Olympics, World Cup, and religion is in there as well.
How are the tragedies that were going to be performed? How are they selected? What? How did that all work?
Okay. It was all very democratic. So about a year before the festival, anybody who wanted could submit a play to the chief magistrate for that year, who was elected by a combination of lot and vote. It's quite a complicated, highly democratic system. And he'd pick 3. But he had to be careful because in classical Athens, when magistrates, even if they got some executive power like that, really got given a hard time if they if he'd gone completely against what people like. So there was a famous year when Euripides didn't get picked, and everybody got really angry about that. Okay. And then when he picked the 3, he allocated them their actors. And this is really, really important. So the poet would have a vague sense. He wouldn't have written the whole play. He'd have sent in a précis, an idea. And he would have, he got actors allocated to them. There were a team of professional actors paid for by the state. So depending on who was your actor. So I'm pretty sure that the years when you have a play with a huge role for a woman, like Medea or Antigone, this is because you've got an actor who was particularly good, because they're all men,
right,
particularly good at either middle-aged women or teenage girls.
What a talent!
Because it was an entirely masked performance, what you actually looked like didn't matter at all.
Right.
So you could theoretically have quite elderly men playing a brilliant Antigone. Why not? Right.
Right.
So you got your actors and you got your chorus about halfway through the year. So the whole company got about 6 months to train.
Wow.
All paid for. You were also allocated a prominent rich guy.
Oh, I heard about that.
Yeah, volunteered. So if you were a steak factory owner and a kind of multi-millionaire, to curry favour with the public, you volunteered and then to pay for the chorus, because that meant keeping 12 young men, feeding them, housing them, training them, and providing their costumes. And how well or not they performed, the chorus line was very important. People who like the American musical tradition get this in a way that actually European theatre people don't. You know the importance of the good chorus line to make a show.
Yeah.
It's exciting in American theatre. So he funded that. And then you competed against the other 2 guys who'd been picked as playwrights. Some of the tragic writers seem to have got more involved in the actual production side than others. Sophocles had been an actor and I think was very I can't prove this, but my hunch is that he was very involved, at least in actor training.
So he was the one who introduced the third actor onto the stage.
He's very, very interested in what a small group of very talented actors can do, and introducing a third actor, of course, absolutely transforms your ability to do tragic irony, because you can have two people discussing something, but you're actually watching the effect on the third person,
right,
who may be silent. Mm-hmm. And the most famous instance of that of all is in Oedipus, when Oedipus is learning from the shepherd that actually he was adopted. What we're all watching Jocasta, his wife, right? So that's the sort of brilliant effect that Sophocles learned how to use. And he was also very famous for his, compared with the other two, for his very plain words. His characters spoke in really very clear and lucid, non-poetic Greek. I mean, it was verse, but he was famous for that, because it's actually very hard philosophically and politically, Sophocles. So he didn't distract you with flowery language. He puts these simple political issues like Antigone standing up against Creon, saying, what you passed is not the sort of law I follow, right? I follow the laws of the gods, right? But it's very, very clear and concise, because that's quite a complicated, big idea.
I think you're right about that. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you one last question. Yeah. And again, thank you so much for spending your time with me.
My pleasure.
What did all of this have to do with Dionysus? I haven't been able to get a clear answer on this. I actually went in search of articles, and everyone said something different.
What's it got to do with Dionysus? Well, that's one of those questions that keeps people like me in a job, because we give whole courses called What's It Got to Do with Dionysus? The fundamental answer to that is actually simply institutional and contextual. These plays were put on at the festivals of Dionysus, right? So they're fundamentally associated in the Greek mind, just as putting on lots of costumes of witches is associated with All Halloween. Now, why on earth would all the saints want you to dress up as something from Star Trek? But people do, right?
Yeah.
So, in a sense, it's not the right question. Anthropologically and ritually, people have pointed to all kinds of things within the worship of Dionysus, though, that you can begin to sense an affinity. One is that in the rites for Dionysus, there was cross-dressing. We know that men dressed up as Maenads, who were Bacchantes, right, when they were worshipping Dionysus. We know that cross-dressing happened. The altered states of consciousness that wine can bring about, and the release of emotion, safely, because you're doing it collectively, together, and drinking the same amount while watching these stories. I think that applies a bit more to comedy, in a way, because they went back in the afternoons are really quite drunk.
Right.
Active, collective use of alcohol to let off steam, right? And that both helps you think about suffering and have a good cry in the mornings when you're watching the tragedies. The other side of it that is masks. We know that masks were used in the worship of Dionysus. Also, the musical instrument associated with Dionysus is not the harp, that's Apollo, right? But these very loud pipes, which are like two tiny oboes. So they've got reeds, and you play them at the same time, which means one's playing a sort of continuous note, and the other one, that instrument is what all the choruses sang to. So it's easier to put together. Also, tragedy just means, you know what it means? It means goat song. One of the things that you do for Dionysus is sacrifice a goat. Yeah? So it looks as though sometime hundreds of years before Sophocles, some sort of proto-theatre had happened when you sacrificed the goat to Dionysus. With masks, maybe cross-dressing.
Oh.
But actually, it's invented at a very particular moment in the 6th century BC by the new sole leader of Athens, Pisistratus, who wants to curry favour with the people. And he actually literally invents tragedy in terms of the big state competitions. He says, we're going to have great shows from now on, and I will pay for them. And we will do them at the festivals of Dionysus, mainly because the other big god was already taken up, Athena.
And he was trying to unite Greece in a way? He was trying to unite Greece in a way?
He was trying to put Athens on the map as a place that Athens is not important in archaic literature. There aren't any Athenian heroes to speak of in the Iliad.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
Athens is a new city compared with Argos and Mycenae and Sparta, even Ithaca. So he's saying, hey, we're going to have the biggest and the best performances you've ever seen, and seems to quite literally have said, I'm founding a tragedy competition. I will put money in, and it should be at the Festival of Dionysus.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, so another great individual to give a ring to our interview, that he had the kind of talent to see that would be a really great thing every spring, to get people coming to Athens, bringing money into the economy, and having a jolly good time, and he did.
Well, very good. I want to thank you so much for spending time with me. And for my listeners, please, again, pick up Introducing the Ancient Greeks. This book is fantastic and so readable.
Aristotle's Way is coming out in America with Penguin next January.
Next January. Okay. And just briefly, Aristotle's Way is about...
It's actually a self-help book, how Aristotle's ethics can change your life. This is Dale Carnegie Gets Aristotle.
Cool. I'm really excited about that. Thank you again.
Thank you too. Will you let me know because I will tweet out the link when you get it up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Thanks
nice
a lot.
To meet you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.